Hey guys, Coach Logan here again with part 3 of my Repertoire series against pawn to e4. In this video I want to cover the Scotch game, which starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now a very direct move from white, pawn to d4. This was kind of a pet line of Garry Kasparov, and it's probably a little bit underrated. I think it's never really seen the popularity of like the Spanish or maybe even the Italian, but it's a good line. White is grabbing space in the center, so after black takes and knight takes, black has given up his central pawn. White has a nice outpost on d5, so it's a credible try for an advantage. So let's jump right into it. So the first thing is, I said with this series I'm going to be recommending knight c6 and knight f6 against pretty much everything, which I will stand by. However, with the Scotch I need to add a little caveat. I would not play knight f6 right here. Pawn to d5 is very uncomfortable. It's just going to drive your knight away and your e5 pawn is hanging and you'll have problems. So first take on d4, knight captures, and now knight f6 I think is an important move. And basically, throughout this whole line of the Scotch, the basic strategic battle will be white has more space, but black is sort of like a half tempo ahead in development because white has moved his knight twice. And black is going to try to maintain that lead until the time is right to open the center and neutralize white's space. So white's two main choices here are knight to c3, which we'll cover at the end. That's I think more of a sideline. The main line although I will say this, knight to c3 is not really a sideline at the scholastic level. I see it quite a bit there, so it's worth covering. But at the high levels, knight takes c6 is the move, b takes c6, and now pawn to e5. Kicking this knight away on f6. So the knight, black now, actually, I think it's important to include this move. Black now plays, before playing knight to d5, they play the move queen to e7, which the idea is you are attacking this pawn in e5 and pinning it at the same time. And white now has to make a little bit of an inconvenient move to defend it, which is queen to e2. I mean, they would like to play something like f4 strategically, but they might run into some issues with, just pawn to d6 or something like that, just immediately breaking down their control of the center. This is a good example of where white just doesn't have enough pieces to hold the space that they've staked at the beginning. So white plays queen e2, restarting the threat on your knight on f6. So knight to d5 now, and then white plays pawn to c4, which gains the tempo on your knight and also gains better control of the center. Here black has a choice between knight b6, which is what I'm going to recommend, or bishop a6 is another move. The idea is you're pinning this pawn. However, I don't know. I think after white just defends it, eventually you're going to have to move this knight anyway, and I'm not actually sure what you get from this pin. I don't think that it's... I think your bishop kind of just gets shut out. So I prefer knight to b6. Okay, and white typically here plays knight to c3, developing a piece. And now an important move from black, queen to e6, which... the purpose of this is you're doing a few things. Primarily, you're reopening your bishop on f8. So if white were to just play really just with a kind of a one-dimensional strategic view of this game and not really considering dynamic possibilities, then let's say they played something like f4 to just try to hold on to the center, play pawn to g3, pawn to b3, fianchetto both bishops and castle, which would lead them to a strategically fantastic position. The problem is just they're going to come under too much pressure too quickly after something like bishop b4. For instance, let's say pawn to g3. Again, white is just trying to secure everything, play bishop to g2, castle, get his other bishop on the other diagonal and claim he has all the space in the world. You're going to find it hard to, you're going to find yourself cramped as black. Problem is they're just very directly losing a pawn with bishop takes c3, b takes, and now the c4 pawn is extremely weak. They'll just lose it. So it's not really what white does here. White usually plays queen to e4. With a similar idea of opening up his bishop on f1, just generally controlling the center a little bit better, and getting towards castling a bit quicker. So now that white has played this, I find the bishop b4 idea is a little bit less appealing, so I like pawn to g6. This was played by a few strong players, like, for instance, Caruana played this in a rapid game versus Topalov and won a nice game a couple of years ago, like 2016 or so. In that game, I think Topalov played bishop e2, although bishop d3 is more common. And here, I think, again, black is just going to continue very directly bishop g7, which attacks the pawn on e5. White usually responds with pawn to f4 because, again, they're being that half tempo down, they're really just forced at every moment to try to hold their center. So black just castles, white usually follows suit, and now I think the time is right to just use your slight lead in development coordination to just play d6 and basically just chop down white's center as it stands right now. White here, it looks as though this hangs a pawn. It looks like white can grab a pawn on c6. But again, this is one where I think black is just better placed for the board to open up. So black can take this pawn on e5. They're now threatening the queen on e6. On c6. I don't think white really wants to trade queens after just bishop takes. Black is hitting the pawn on c4. They're sort of hitting the pawn on f4, although that is defended. And if white were to just take, black could grab back either of these pawns, but I think they could even throw in an in-between move, like something like rook to d8, hitting this bishop. And again, I think black's lead in development is going to play quite nicely. They will win back both their pawns with a nice position on an open board. Or sorry, they'll win back their one pawn that they're down, but they'll have a nice position on the board. After d takes e5, white could play queen takes c7, but now there's a nice move here, pawn to f5, which just gets ready to play pawn to e4 here. There was one game in the database with a strong player where white played pawn to c5, which dislodges this knight on, or at least appears to dislodge the knight on b6, but black plays rook f7, and now we find that white's queen is in a bit of a pickle. So in the game, white just played queen d8, and after rook f8, queen back to c7, rook to f7, and ended up just taking a draw here with a repetition. It's worth pointing out that I don't think they can try to trade off pieces and go into an endgame a pawn up. Like after takes, black now has a nice intermezzo, pawn to e4, kicking the bishop, which cannot come to c4 because of our knight that's well placed for that. And after something like, say, bishop to e2, black will just play bishop e6. His bishops are fantastic. He has a protected pass or extra space on the king side. He'll round up this d6 pawn. There's not much doubt about that. Just one of the rooks coming to d8, and he'll gang up on that pawn, and I think black is doing quite well here. So it made sense that in the game, white just took the perpetual with queen back to c7 and d8 and so on. There's definitely other ways white can play this type of line, but I think that really gives a good feel for how black should be playing it, which is, again, knight b6, queen e6 with the idea, potentially a bishop b4, but if they play queen e4, fianchetto, you're gonna fianchetto, you're gonna castle, and then blast away with d6, and you might have to do some small dynamic calculation, but you're just almost always coming out fine in that for black. Okay, so the other main line, or the other line you're likely to see, and especially if you're a Scholastic player watching this, like most of the players I see, white can play knight to c3, which this is another clearly a principled move. They're developing a piece and trying to better secure their pawn on e4 and control the d5 square. So again, I think black needs to play very directly and try to use his extra half tempo to continue to put pressure on white. And the best way to do that is bishop to b4, which again carries a very direct threat. You're threatening to take on e4, which is not so easy for white to defend. For instance, I played blitz games against players who are way too strong to do such a thing, but I've seen them play bishop d3 here, which, as silly as it is, it just hangs a knight on d4. The way they should defend it is they'll play knight takes c6. Black should take towards the center in this instance because they really want to get the move d5 in. Again, black does have a space problem, so they need to try to play to rip open the center and free themselves. And now white plays bishop d3. So black here plays, as I was saying, this plays pawn to d5, now just sort of breaking down white's control of the center. at which point white usually takes this. It's worth noting again, I don't think this e5 push is that great. Black can throw his knight to g4, which attacks the pawn. And after white, say, castles, okay, black is not really going to grab the pawn. That would be disastrous after knight takes e5 and rook e1. I think they're just going to lose a piece. But instead could just castle, and now they really are, honest to goodness, threatening the pawn. And after something like, I don't know, say some way to defend this pawn. Let's say bishop f4 makes some sense. Black can play f6, and after, again, they're threatening that pawn, and after something like takes, and takes back with the queen, I think black stands quite well here. I really don't believe white can go, you know, grabbing stuff here. There's too much pressure. For instance, I think they can just take on f2, and this is going to be a problem for white. Okay, so back in this position after d5, white is almost always just taking the pawn, and black can play c takes d5 here and have a totally acceptable position, but I quite like this idea here of just castling. And white should just castle here. I mean, that's the main move. But if white decides to get greedy and play d takes c6, black now can start using their lead in development, not necessarily to open lines because they've already been opened, but to really start pressuring white. For instance, bishop, let's say bishop to g4. Black is down 2 pawns at the moment, but they're coming with direct pressure on the queen. F3 would allow rook e8 or some other annoying options. So if they say play bishop to e2, which appears to make a lot of sense, white is breaking, you know, the attack on the queen, looking to swap pieces. Black has this very nice move here, avoiding the queen trade, avoiding a trade of bishops, and opening up a very crucial square. They can play queen to e8, which is critical in opening the d8 square for rook to d8. Notice there's no bishop takes g4 because of the pin. And for instance, if white were to castle here, which is a natural move, after rook to d8, white is actually just losing a piece. There's no good way to get out of the threats. For instance, if bishop to d2, black can grab either minor piece. They could play bishop takes e2, which wins a piece after, say, queen takes, exchange, and just taking on d2. Or they could even play bishop takes c3, which is also winning a piece after something like, if bishop takes c3, we just take on e2, and if this bishop takes, we can once again just grab on d2, and you're winning a piece. So this idea of if they play bishop e2, just playing queen to e8 with rook to d8 is very powerful. I've caught a few players with this trick. So most of the time after the move pawn to d5, e takes d5 castles, white just castles, which is definitely the most prudent choice. But again, black delays recapturing on d5 and throws in bishop to g4. White typically will play f3 here now, which makes some sense since they've been castled. Bishop h5. And again, white grabs the second pawn, but they're not holding on to it. The f3 move was weakening, which allows queen to d4 check. The king moves to h1, and after an exchange on c3, black grabs back one of the pawns immediately. White is really only up a half pawn because the pawn is doubled and isolated on c6, and black will just grab it back shortly. After something like rook to b1, and black could just take the pawn now. It's not really that bad a move, but they could also play bishop g6 to counteract white's bishop. This way, white won't get to maintain a bishop pair, and I think this is just quite even. It's not smart for white to try any shenanigans with his rook on the 7th rank, because after black just takes, he'll just have to move it back, and black's rooks are going to come to the open file soon, and I think black is doing quite fine here. I've never really had a struggle from this position, and you know, it's objectively it's probably just even, but you know, you could argue white's played f3. Maybe that'll cause some problems for his king in the long run. But I think this is the easiest route to equality for black against the 4-knight Scotch, which is what this line is with knight c3. So yeah, that about covers it. There's, again, with all these videos, I'm noticing there's lots more things that I could go into depth on, but this is mostly just to give you like kind of an intro course to how to play e5 confidently as black. And I think, again, the main points I want to hit on, especially against the Scotch, are that white does have a lead in space and is statically doing very well, so I think it's critical for black to apply pressure with quick development and a timely opening of the center. So yeah, I'm a big fan of knight f6 here, and if knight takes, eventually you're going to look to break down their pawn on e5. If knight c3, just a quick bishop b4, and eventually you'll get a d5 in and try to break it down that way. Okay, so I'll see you guys for the next video.